The night I stood outside my own house, holding a suitcase that I did not pack, staring at a front door that no longer opened for me. I finally understood that grief was not the most humiliating pain a man can experience. Losing my son had shattered my heart in a way that felt permanent. Yet being erased from the home I built with my own hands revealed a deeper cruelty, one that did not scream or collapse loudly, but instead stripped dignity layer by layer until nothing remained except silence and realization. I had buried my only child 3 weeks earlier, and I believed that moment would be the lowest point of my existence. Yet I was wrong, because death takes what it must and leaves you broken, while betrayal watches you break and decides you are no longer necessary. My name is Richard Bennett. I am 68 years old, and until that evening I believed that sacrifice created security, that loyalty created permanence, and that family created protection against the cold mathematics of the world. I spent more than 4 decades working as a structural engineer in Northern California, building foundations designed to outlast storms and earthquakes, yet I never imagined that the foundation of my own life could be removed without warning and without resistance. I built bridges, office towers, and residential complexes that still stand today, but the structure I trusted most was my family, and that was the only structure that collapsed completely. Daniel Bennett was my only son, my greatest achievement, and the center of every decision I made after the day he was born. He was 42 years old when a sudden stroke ended his life, without negotiation or mercy, leaving behind a hospital room filled with mechanical sounds that continued even after his heartbeat stopped. He had built a technology logistics company that revolutionized distribution systems across multiple states, and just months before his death he finalized a $60 million acquisition deal that secured his financial legacy beyond anything I ever imagined possible. I stood beside his grave during the funeral, listening to executives describe him as visionary and unstoppable, and I felt both pride and devastation blend into a heavy and immovable weight inside my chest. When I returned home after the burial, I walked through the hallway of the house I purchased 35 years earlier, and felt as though every wall carried a memory that refused to release me. That house was where Daniel learned to walk, where my late wife Eleanor decorated every holiday table with patience and care, where I stayed awake calculating engineering drafts to ensure Daniel would never feel financial limitation while chasing his ambitions. The garage still carried faint marks from his first prototype experiments, and the dining room still echoed with conversations about scaling and strategy. During the early stages of his company, it was not simply property, and it was not merely an address, but a lifetime of disciplined effort compressed into brick and wood. At first I believed that grief would be my only burden after Daniel's passing. Yet grief is honest in its cruelty, because it does not pretend to be anything other than loss. What I did not anticipate was how quickly the atmosphere inside that house would change once the $60 million from Daniel's company acquisition transferred into the designated beneficiary account. His wife, Victoria Bennett, became the sole recipient of that fortune, and although I did not question the legality of the arrangement, I underestimated how dramatically money can shift perception, authority, and intention within a family. In the weeks that followed, I observed subtle adjustments that most people would dismiss as necessary organization. Financial advisors visited more frequently, documents were rearranged, conversations shifted from remembrance to restructuring. Victoria's composure became sharper, more deliberate, and less emotional with each passing day. Meanwhile, I moved quietly through the house, touching furniture as if confirming that it still belonged to me, sitting longer than necessary in Daniel's childhood bedroom, and standing in the garage remembering the nights he asked for my opinion while pretending he did not need guidance. 3 weeks after I buried my son, I returned from a long walk through the neighborhood to clear my thoughts, only to find my leather suitcase positioned beside the front door in a way that suggested planning rather than accident. The sight unsettled me, yet my mind resisted immediate interpretation, because humiliation rarely announces itself clearly at first. As I stepped further into the living room, I noticed that several of my framed photographs were no longer displayed in the hallway. My personal documents had been neatly stacked on the console table, and even my reading chair had been subtly repositioned as though the space had already adjusted to my absence. Victoria stood near the staircase with an expression that contained neither visible sorrow nor hesitation. And in that moment, I understood that decisions had already been finalized without my involvement. She explained that the house legally belonged to her, that she required independence to move forward, and that I would be more comfortable elsewhere. Yet beneath the language of practicality, I heard the unmistakable truth that $60 million had redefined my relevance within these walls. The fortune Daniel built had transformed her from partner to proprietor, and my presence no longer aligned with her plans. I did not argue because I recognized the shift immediately. And at 68 years old, there is a particular humiliation in understanding that resistance will not restore what has already been removed. I looked around the living room and saw decades of disciplined sacrifice reduced to inconvenience, and I felt a quiet fracture inside me that grief alone had not caused. Losing my son had devastated my heart, but being discarded from the home, I dismantled something tied to identity and worth. When I lifted the suitcase, the weight felt heavier than its contents justified, as though it carried compressed years of effort and expectation. I paused at the doorway and allowed my eyes to travel across the staircase, the dining table, the fireplace, and the hallway, where Eleanor's laughter once echoed. And I understood that I was not simply leaving a house, but being removed from a narrative that I had constructed through relentless sacrifice. The door closed behind me with controlled finality, and I stood on the driveway, realizing that I had become an outsider in the only place I ever considered permanent. Neighbors passed without noticing the shift in my existence, and the world continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet inside me, something irreversible had begun to form. Victoria believed that inheriting $60 million meant she had inherited control over everything Daniel built, including the foundation upon which his success stood. Yet she failed to understand that while money transfers through accounts instantly, knowledge transfers differently, and Daniel had trusted me with insights long before his company reached its peak valuation. As I walked away from the house for what she assumed would be the final time, I understood that I had lost my son and my home within 3 weeks. But I had not lost my discipline, my memory, or my ability to observe, and sometimes those qualities create consequences far greater than wealth. As I walked away from the house for what Victoria believed would be the final time, I felt something shift inside me that was colder and more focused than grief. The initial humiliation still pressed heavily against my chest, but beneath it something steadier began to rise, something disciplined and observant that had guided me through 40 years of engineering decisions where emotional reactions often led to structural failure. I had spent my life studying load distribution, pressure points, and the invisible weaknesses that bring down entire systems. And I understood that what appears solid from the outside often depends on a few critical elements that most people never notice. Victoria inherited $60 million from the sale of Daniel's company. She inherited the house. She inherited the public narrative of being the successful widow of a visionary entrepreneur. What she did not inherit was understanding. I checked into a modest extended-stay hotel on the outskirts of the city that evening, choosing practicality over comfort because I needed clarity more than luxury. The room was simple, neutral, and impersonal, yet its emptiness gave me something the house had not given me in weeks, which was silence without tension. I placed my suitcase near the bed and sat down slowly, allowing the reality of my new position to settle without resistance. At 68 years old, displacement feels different than it does at 30. It is not merely inconvenience, but a direct challenge to identity. I had always been the foundation beneath my family's ambitions, the quiet provider, the stabilizing force during uncertainty. Now I was reduced to a man in a temporary room watching his life contract into a few personal belongings. Yet humiliation, when processed correctly, becomes information. And information, when handled patiently, becomes leverage. Daniel had trusted me long before investors trusted him. During the early development of his logistics platform, he would sit with me in the garage and describe not only the visible components of his business model, but also the structural architecture behind it. He believed in redundancy, layered ownership, and silent safeguards. He once told me that visible success attracts predators, and that true security is built beneath the surface where few people think to look. At the time, I assumed he was speaking about competitors. I did not realize he was also speaking about proximity. Months before the acquisition finalized, Daniel had created a secondary holding structure tied to intellectual property licensing that was not included in the primary sale agreement. The acquiring corporation purchased the operational infrastructure and brand, but several algorithmic patents remained under a separate entity designed for long-term strategic leverage. Daniel had structured it carefully, intentionally and quietly. Victoria never involved herself in the technical foundation of the company. Her strengths were image management, networking, and public positioning. She enjoyed the spotlight of success, but rarely engaged in the engineering conversations that shaped the company's core. When the acquisition closed and $60 million transferred into her designated beneficiary account, she assumed the chapter had ended. She never questioned whether the entire story had been sold. 2 days after moving into the hotel, I scheduled a private meeting with Michael Carter, the family attorney who had known Daniel since his early startup days. Michael had always been discreet and methodical, the kind of professional who understood that silence can be more valuable than visibility. He did not ask unnecessary questions. When I requested access to specific corporate documents tied to Daniel's pre-acquisition structures, when the files were placed before me, I felt the first genuine sense of stability since the funeral. The secondary holding entity still existed, the patents remained active, and most importantly, Daniel had listed me as the controlling trustee in the event of his death. Victoria inherited liquidity, I inherited leverage. The intellectual property tied to the logistics optimization algorithms was not merely residual code, but a scalable framework adaptable to emerging supply chain disruptions that had intensified nationwide. Daniel believed the acquiring corporation underestimated its long-term potential, and he deliberately positioned the patents outside the core sale package to preserve strategic flexibility. Victoria saw $60 million as final victory. Daniel saw it as a milestone. I sat in that quiet office reviewing documents and realized something that steadied my breathing for the first time in weeks. I had not been discarded entirely. I had been underestimated. Meanwhile, Victoria began living the life she believed she deserved. Social media announcements subtly referenced new beginnings and future expansions. Interior renovation crews were hired to modernize the house that once carried Eleanor's warmth. Luxury vehicles appeared in the driveway within weeks. Investment advisors rotated in and out with increasing frequency. From a distance, it appeared as though she had stepped confidently into her new era. Yet sudden wealth often accelerates exposure rather than protection. Daniel understood delayed gratification. Victoria embraced immediate display. Through Samuel Reed, Daniel's former business partner who maintained limited but respectful contact with me, I learned that Victoria had begun exploring high-risk ventures outside her expertise, leveraging portions of her liquidity into speculative technology startups driven more by trend than substance. She positioned herself publicly as a strategic investor despite lacking the technical comprehension that guided Daniel's decision-making. I did not interfere. I did not warn. I observed. The secondary holding entity required refinement, not liquidation. I initiated a quiet restructuring process, repositioning the patents under a strategic advisory model targeting mid-sized logistics firms. Struggling with post-acquisition inefficiencies created by Daniel's company integration into the larger corporation, the acquiring entity focused on scaling. Brand presence but scalability often sacrifices precision, and precision was exactly what Daniel's algorithms delivered. Small contracts began forming discreetly. Consultations expanded. Licensing agreements multiplied gradually, rather than dramatically. I did not seek headlines. I sought stability. Victoria, unaware of the silent activity, continued increasing her public presence. Invitations to industry events positioned her as the visionary widow carrying forward Daniel's legacy yet behind. The polished surface, her investment portfolio began experiencing volatility. High-risk ventures rarely reward impatience, and she displayed impatience repeatedly. 6 months after she forced me out of my home, the first signs of strain appeared. One of her speculative investments collapsed under regulatory scrutiny. Another failed to secure follow-up funding. Market shifts exposed the fragility of trend-based positioning without technical depth. Her liquidity began to shrink more quickly than expected, and the cost of maintaining a lifestyle built on visibility intensified. Meanwhile, the patents under my control gained recognition within specialized logistics circles for improving efficiency, metrics that the acquiring corporation struggled to maintain at scale. What Daniel designed was never about rapid expansion alone. but about precision optimization that required hands-on oversight. And oversight was something I could provide. I moved from the extended stay hotel into a modest but permanent residence, choosing privacy over spectacle. I hired a small team of analysts who valued function over fame, revenue streams, diversified steadily, not explosively, and that steady growth created something more durable than sudden wealth. It created control. Victoria still believed I had been reduced to irrelevance. She believed removing me from the house had removed me from influence. She believed that money defined power. What she did not understand was that control over intellectual infrastructure shapes markets more effectively than cash reserves that evaporate under poor judgment. A year after Daniel's death, industry reports began highlighting inefficiencies in the acquiring corporation's integration strategy, referencing emerging competitors utilizing advanced optimization frameworks that outperformed legacy systems. My advisory model remained unnamed publicly, but within private circles, recognition expanded. Victoria's financial posture weakened further. Her investments required additional capital injections to remain afloat. Her visible lifestyle demanded continuous expenditure. Liquidity, once abundant, began fragmenting. And for the first time since she closed the door behind me, the balance began to tilt. I did not feel triumph. I felt inevitability, because structures built on display often collapse under pressure, while structures built quietly beneath the surface endure. Victoria inherited $60 million, but she never inherited Daniel's discipline, and she certainly never inherited mine. The real shift, however, had not yet begun, because the house she claimed as her symbol of dominance was about to become the center of her unraveling, and this time the pressure would not come from lawyers or courts. It would come from something far more personal. Victoria believed that wealth insulated her from consequence, yet wealth without discipline functions like a building constructed on decorative pillars rather than reinforced steel. It stands impressively at first glance, but the stress fractures begin long before anyone notices the tilt. I had spent decades analyzing buildings that appeared magnificent from the outside, while internal support systems weakened invisibly, and I recognized the same pattern forming around her life. The renovation of the house accelerated during the months following my departure. Interior walls were removed in pursuit of modern openness. Imported stone replaced the original fireplace Eleanor once polished by hand. The garage where Daniel built his first prototype was redesigned into a showroom-style entertainment space, eliminating the last visible trace of its earlier purpose. Victoria framed these changes publicly as transformation and renewal. Yet to me they represented something else entirely, which was erasure. Erasure, however, often destabilizes more than it refreshes. Through Samuel Reed, who remained professionally connected to several executives inside the acquiring corporation, I learned that internal dissatisfaction was rising. The integration of Daniel's company into the larger corporate framework had produced scale but sacrificed precision. Clients who once praised the platform's adaptability began reporting inefficiencies that impacted their distribution metrics. The corporation responded with layered bureaucracy, which further diluted responsiveness. Meanwhile, the licensing model under my quiet advisory structure continued refining Daniel's original algorithmic architecture. Rather than chasing expansion, we optimized performance for specific sectors that demanded customization. Our clients were not interested in publicity, but in measurable efficiency improvements. And those improvements translated into consistent contractual renewals. Revenue increased steadily, not in dramatic surges, but in disciplined increments. Victoria's financial trajectory, by contrast, became volatile. One of her most visible investments in a trending artificial intelligence startup faced regulatory investigation regarding data handling practices. Market confidence declined sharply. Her position, heavily leveraged, required additional capital infusion to prevent liquidation. Another venture in speculative renewable infrastructure failed to secure anticipated government incentives, reducing projected returns dramatically. Liquidity that once felt infinite began thinning. Publicly, she maintained composure. Privately, she began reallocating assets. I observed carefully, not with bitterness, but with calculated patience. There is a difference between revenge, driven by emotion, and consequence, driven by structure. Emotion seeks immediate satisfaction. Structure waits for gravity to do its work. I chose structure. A year and a half after Daniel's death, the acquiring corporation announced a restructuring initiative intended to address operational inefficiencies tied to the original integration. Industry analysts speculated that core algorithmic limitations contributed to declining optimization metrics, yet they lacked awareness that the most adaptive components of Daniel's intellectual property had never been included in the acquisition package. Our advisory entity, though discreet, began attracting attention from firms seeking alternatives to large-scale integration models. Confidential negotiations expanded into multi-state contracts. What began as modest licensing transformed into strategic partnerships that generated recurring revenue streams exceeding my initial projections. For the first time since standing outside that house with a suitcase in my hand, I felt not merely stable but formidable. Victoria, however, began experiencing tangible strain. Her property taxes increased significantly following the extensive renovations and reassessment of the home's market value. Maintenance costs escalated alongside lifestyle expectations. Luxury vehicles depreciated rapidly. Her social visibility required continuous investment in image cultivation. Wealth, when tied to perception, demands constant feeding. Liquidity shrank further. She began liquidating secondary assets to cover leveraged positions. Advisors shifted tone from expansion to containment. The $60 million that once appeared untouchable gradually fragmented under cumulative misjudgment. Then came the turning point neither of us publicly acknowledged, yet both felt. The acquiring corporation initiated exploratory discussions regarding reacquisition of certain algorithmic patents that they had previously dismissed as non-essential. Internal data confirmed that optimization gaps stemmed from components no longer under their control. Samuel discreetly informed me that executives were actively searching for leverage to regain technological superiority. They did not know that the controlling trustee remained the father they once considered peripheral. When their representatives approached my advisory entity with preliminary proposals, I did not rush negotiations. I required detailed performance reports, forward projections, and long-term, strategic commitments that secured not only compensation but influence. I understood that selling the patents outright would replicate Victoria's error, which was exchanging structure for liquidity. Instead, I pursued partnership integration, under my terms ensuring continued oversight and recurring revenue far exceeding what a one-time transaction could provide. The agreement, finalized quietly, elevated my position beyond simple recovery. It positioned me as essential. Industry recognition followed, though my name rarely appeared in headlines. Within executive circles, however, my role became undeniable. The narrative that once framed me as a displaced retiree dissolved into irrelevance. Victoria, meanwhile, confronted compounding financial contraction. One of her most visible investments declared insolvency. Legal disputes among minority stakeholders drained additional capital. Her remaining portfolio required restructuring under unfavorable conditions. Advisors who once praised aggressive growth strategies now recommended austerity. The house that symbolized her authority became increasingly expensive to maintain. And then the market shifted again. A regional economic slowdown impacted high-value residential properties, reducing liquidity in the luxury segment. Selling the house at peak valuation became impossible. Carrying costs intensified. Mortgage restructuring, initiated after she leveraged portions of the property for investment capital, tightened further. The same house where she placed my suitcase beside the door began transforming from trophy to burden. I did not celebrate. I did not contact her. I continued strengthening my position. 2 years after she forced me out, the acquiring corporation announced a strategic relaunch of their logistics platform, powered by advanced optimization enhancements, licensed through my advisory entity. Stock prices responded favorably. Media outlets described the move as visionary recalibration. Victoria watched the coverage. She recognized the architecture. She recognized the algorithms. And for the first time since Daniel's death, she understood that the narrative she believed concluded when she closed. That front door had only just begun. Yet the most decisive shift had not yet occurred. Because financial contraction is survivable if pride remains intact. But what happens when pride collapses alongside liquidity? Changes everything. And Victoria Bennett was about to experience both. The financial pressure intensified gradually at first, and then all at once, much like structural fatigue that accumulates silently until the moment the material can no longer absorb additional strain. Her remaining high-risk ventures required emergency capital injections that she could no longer comfortably provide. Several investors who once aligned themselves with her visibility withdrew support once performance metrics declined, leaving her exposed to obligations she had underestimated. The $60 million that once appeared inexhaustible had been fragmented by leverage, speculation, and maintenance of image. The house became the central weight. Its reassessed value increased tax exposure. The renovations that symbolized renewal now demanded constant upkeep. The mortgage restructuring she initiated to unlock additional liquidity tightened under shifting interest conditions. What once felt like a throne became a liability anchored in polished stone and imported marble. I did not initiate her unraveling. I allowed gravity to complete its work. Meanwhile, the strategic relaunch of the logistics platform under my licensing oversight transformed market perception. Performance reports demonstrated measurable efficiency gains that exceeded original benchmarks achieved. During Daniel's leadership, industry analysts described the enhancement as a necessary return to disciplined architecture. Within executive circles, my influence was no longer invisible. The acquiring corporation extended long-term integration agreements that secured recurring revenue streams beyond what Daniel's initial sale would have provided had he retained operational control. The structure I negotiated ensured that the patents remained under advisory governance, preserving leverage while multiplying financial yield. My net worth 2 years after standing on that driveway with a suitcase exceeded the $60 million Victoria inherited. Yet wealth alone did not satisfy me. Dignity restored mattered more. The decisive moment arrived not through confrontation, but through inevitability. Victoria was forced to list the house for sale after failing to stabilize her remaining investments. The luxury market slowdown reduced buyer demand, prolonging the listing and intensifying financial strain. Public records reflected the price reductions. Industry acquaintances whispered about overextension. The same social circles that once celebrated her rapid ascent now observed her contraction with quiet distance. Eventually, the house sold at a valuation significantly lower than its peak assessment, and the buyer was an entity connected to my advisory network. I did not purchase it impulsively. I acquired it deliberately. When ownership transferred, the property returned not as a trophy, but as a restored foundation. I walked through the front door months later without spectacle and without announcement, observing the alterations Victoria had imposed. The imported stone remained. The modernized interior remained. Yet beneath cosmetic transformation, the structure still carried the original foundation I financed decades earlier. I restored what mattered. The garage was redesigned once again into a functional workspace, honoring Daniel's beginnings. The fireplace was reconstructed using materials that reflected Eleanor's original design. The house did not revert to nostalgia, but it reclaimed integrity. Victoria, displaced by financial contraction and diminished liquidity, relocated into a significantly smaller residence outside the circles she once navigated confidently. Her public presence declined as invitations disappeared and influence shifted elsewhere. Investors who once aligned themselves with her visibility pursued more stable partnerships. Her attempt to leverage status without substance had reached its natural conclusion. There was no courtroom. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was only consequence. Months after reacquiring the house, I attended a private industry conference where the acquiring corporation formally acknowledged the strategic advisory leadership that restored their platform's dominance. My role, once invisible, was recognized among executives who valued results over spectacle. Applause filled the room not because of inheritance or publicity, but because of disciplined execution. In that moment, I understood something profound. Victoria believed money created power. Daniel understood structure created power. And I understood patience multiplied power. I stood once again inside the house that had once expelled me and felt neither bitterness nor triumph, but equilibrium. The driveway where I once stood holding a suitcase now carried a different meaning. It no longer symbolized humiliation. It symbolized transition. Grief for my son remained, because no restoration of wealth can replace a child, yet I no longer carried the weight of being discarded. I had been underestimated, and underestimation became my advantage. Victoria lost more than liquidity. She lost the illusion that dominance can be purchased without discipline. And I regained more than property. I regained position, control, and the quiet confidence that comes from building structures others fail to see until it is too late. The night she closed that door behind me, she believed she ended my relevance. What she actually did was remove distraction, and sometimes removal is the greatest gift an opponent can unknowingly provide. I am 68 years old, and I have learned that grief reveals what matters. Humiliation reveals who you are, and patience reveals who truly holds power. She inherited $60 million. I inherited the foundation. And in the end, foundations always outlast display. So I ask you a question. What would you do if someone stole everything you built after a loved one passed away? Could you wait and plan the perfect revenge, or would you act immediately?